Disclaimer: this video contains discussions of real criminal cases and sensitive subject matter. It is created for educational and documentary purposes only. Viewer discretion is advised. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. On an early autumn morning in Ontario, the quiet rustle of leaves carried an unease that had long haunted a town. A woman walking her golden retriever along a wooded trail noticed her dog stop suddenly, ears pricked, tail stiff. He pawed at the ground near the edge of a clearing. When she looked closer, she saw the faint glimmer of something buried beneath the soil, a small chain tangled in dirt and moss with a locket shaped like a heart. The initials engraved inside would soon send chills through seasoned detectives. C. J. They belonged to Christine Jessop, a 9-year-old girl who had vanished 36 years earlier after leaving home to meet a friend. Her murder had gone unsolved for decades, tearing her family apart and turning her town into a place of whispered prayers and unhealed grief. It had been one of Canada's most notorious cold cases, Christine's disappearance in 1984, the wrongful conviction of Guy Paul Morin, and the lingering absence of real justice. But what no one expected was that the discovery made by a dog walker, combined with the power of modern genetic genealogy, would finally expose the truth that had been buried just as deeply as that locket. On October 3, 1984, Christine Jessop bounded out of her family's home in Queensville, Ontario, carrying her baseball glove. She was full of energy, all freckles and laughter, a fourth grader who loved animals and was looking forward to seeing her friend for a playdate. Her mother was at work. Her father was visiting his brother in prison. Her older brother, Ken, was nearby. Christine never arrived at her friend's house. By evening, panic was pulsing through the small town. Neighbors joined the search. Police combed through fields, and volunteers shouted her name into the wind. Days passed with no trace, until December 31st, 1984, when a farmer in Sunderland, 50 kilometers away, stumbled upon a grisly scene. Christine's remains were found in a field, partially concealed by brush. The autopsy confirmed what her family feared most. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The horror tore through the Jessop family, but it also consumed their town. Fear turned into suspicion. Police zeroed in on a quiet, music-loving neighbor named Guy Paul Morin, a man who didn't quite fit in. When he was arrested in 1985, the community exhaled with a sense of closure, desperate for someone to blame. But the truth was still buried beneath layers of forensic error and investigative tunnel vision. Morin was convicted in 1992 after years of trials, retrials, and speculation. He proclaimed his innocence all along, and years later, DNA evidence proved him right. The conviction was overturned in 1995, making Morin one of Canada's most famous victims of wrongful imprisonment. The police and the public were left with the haunting question: if it wasn't him, then who killed Christine Jessop? The case grew cold, but it never went quiet. Forensic technology evolved, first DNA fingerprinting, then mitochondrial DNA, then the revolutionary world of genetic genealogy. Detectives carefully preserved evidence from Christine's clothing, knowing that someday science might outpace the limitations of the past. Decades later, in 2020, a York Regional Police Cold Case Unit reopened the file with one purpose: re-examine the DNA profile that had once cleared Morin. New analysis confirmed it came from the killer, but who? Investigators uploaded the genetic profile into a genealogical database used by families seeking to trace ancestry. It was there, among tens of thousands of DNA records, that a match began to form. A distant relative connected through family trees and shared centimorgans Weeks of genealogical mapping narrowed it down to one man, Calvin Hoover, a neighbor and family acquaintance of the Jessops back in 1984. Hoover had been interviewed briefly after Christine's death, but was never considered a suspect. He died long before the truth surfaced, but his DNA, collected from the scene decades earlier, told a story that he never could. The town thought it had long buried its ghosts until that morning in the woods. The dog walker's discovery of Christine's locket, unearthed near a now defunct trail where Hoover was known to walk, prompted forensic teams to research the surrounding area. Embedded in the soil was a rusted piece of wire and fibers matching the type found with Christine's clothing. Though it didn't change the DNA conclusion, it helped reconstruct Hoover's movements that night, proving that the killer had revisited the site after the murder. It was the kind of chilling detail that cold cases rarely yield. The realization that, for years, the answer had lain only feet below the surface, waiting for an ordinary person and her dog to stumble upon it. When police publicly confirmed Calvin Hoover as Christine Jessop's murderer in October 2020, the nation gasped. Her mother, Janet, wept in disbelief. Decades of doubt, grief, and injustice finally had a name attached to them. For Guy Paul Morin, the news was bittersweet, a confirmation of innocence, but also a reminder of how cruelly fate had twisted his life. In a press statement, Morin said softly, "I hope the Jessop family can find peace." His words carried the weight of every wrongly accused man who ever sat in a cell wondering if truth would ever surface. Christine's locket, cleaned and restored, now rests with her family. It's a symbol of innocence, of loss, and of the fact that even decades later, the smallest discovery, a chain glinting beneath fallen leaves, can reignite hope. The story of Christine Jessop isn't just a tragedy, it's a cautionary tale about the persistence of truth. A child's life was taken, an innocent man's freedom stolen, and a family's faith in justice fractured. Yet, through time, technology, and the compassion of strangers, a dog walker, a forensic genealogist, a detective who refused to quit, the silence was finally broken. In the end, it wasn't a detective with a badge who solved the case, but a combination of science and simple humanity. A woman who stopped when her dog refused to move, and a strand of DNA that refused to be forgotten. To Christine Jessop and to all the families still waiting, may your stories find their endings, and may no truth stay buried forever. On an early autumn morning in Ontario, the air was crisp, the sky a dull gray, and the only sound was the rhythmic shuffle of footsteps on a narrow woodland trail. A woman walking her golden retriever paused when the dog stopped abruptly, staring at a patch of disturbed earth near a rotting log. He barked once, low and insistent, then began pawing at the ground. The woman knelt beside him, brushing aside a layer of leaves and dirt until something metallic caught the light. It was a small, heart-shaped locket, tangled in moss and soil, the initials C, J, engraved in faded script. She didn't know it then, but that single moment, born of a dog's curiosity, was about to reopen one of Canada's most haunting mysteries, the 1984 murder of 9-year-old Christine Jessop, a case that had shattered a community, imprisoned an innocent man, and left a family to endure 36 years of unanswered questions. Christine was a joyful, freckle-faced child who loved animals and baseball. On October 3, 1984, she left her home in Queensville, Ontario, to meet a friend and never return. Her disappearance turned a quiet town into a landscape of fear. Neighbors searched ditches and fields, helicopters swept the skies, and the Jessop family clung to hope that Christine had simply gotten lost. But 3 months later, on New Year's Eve, that hope was crushed when a farmer in Sunderland discovered her remains. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered, her body left in a remote field surrounded by silence. The horror of that day never left the small town. Police scrambled for answers, and when the pressure mounted, they turned their suspicion toward Guy Paul Moran, the Jessop's quiet violin-playing neighbor who lived next door. He was different, reserved, introverted, the kind of man small communities sometimes look at with quiet mistrust. When investigators searched his home and found items they claimed were consistent with guilt, it was enough to set off a chain of events that would scar his life forever. Moran was arrested and charged with Christine's murder. Despite his unwavering claims of innocence, he was convicted in 1992 after 2 trials filled with unreliable witnesses, questionable forensics, and tunnel vision by investigators desperate to close the case. The town finally exhaled, thinking justice had been served, but in truth, the real killer was still out there. In 1995, new DNA testing cleared Moran completely. The samples from Christine's clothing didn't match his DNA profile. He was exonerated, and the Ontario government formally apologized for the wrongful conviction. But even as Moran tried to rebuild his life, the Jessop family remained trapped in a different kind of prison, the not knowing. Who had taken their daughter's life, years turned into decades. Forensic technology advanced, but Christine's killer remained a ghost until 2020, when the York Regional Police Cold Case Unit reopened the file. Detective Inspector Hank Eidsinger, known for his meticulous work, sent the preserved DNA evidence for reanalysis using the latest tools in genetic genealogy, the same breakthrough technology that had unmasked the Golden State Killer in California. The DNA from the original crime scene was uploaded into a genealogical database, and slowly the family tree began to build itself. For weeks, genetic genealogists pored over distant matches, third cousins, great uncles, obscure branches stretching across provinces, until one name began to surface through shared ancestry and geographical proximity: Calvin Hoover. He had been a family acquaintance in 1984, living in the same neighborhood, and had even known the Jessops personally. He was interviewed briefly at the time, but never considered a serious suspect. Hoover had died by suicide in 2015, years before his name would re-emerge from the shadows. When investigators obtained Hoover's DNA from archived samples, the match was undeniable. The probability of error was infinitesimal. After 36 years, Christine Jessop's killer finally had a name, but the story didn't end with the lab report. The dog walker's discovery of Christine's locket that morning, found not far from an old trail Hoover was known to frequent, sparked a new forensic search of the area. Investigators unearthed degraded fibers and soil imprints consistent with materials found at Christine's original recovery site, providing the missing geographical link that confirmed Hoover's movements that night. The locket itself, once cleaned and restored, was verified as Christine's, a piece of evidence lost decades earlier, now returned by pure chance and instinct. When police publicly announced the results in October 2020, the town of Queensville fell silent. For Christine's mother, Janet Jessop, it was both a relief and a heartbreak. The truth had finally surfaced, but the man responsible was long gone. There would be no trial, no confession, no face-to-face confrontation, only the quiet echo of justice, delayed but not denied. For Guy Paul Moran, the revelation was a bittersweet closure. He issued a brief statement saying, "I am relieved for Christine's family that the truth has finally been uncovered, but I mourn that it took this long." His life, once upended by injustice, became a testament to the dangers of assumption and the redemptive power of science. As for the woman who found the locket, she asked not to be named. She said it didn't feel right to take credit for something that belonged to Christine's memory. But her discovery reminded everyone that sometimes the key to solving the unsolvable lies in the smallest acts of attention: a dog's bark, a flash of silver beneath the dirt, a call to authorities that no one expected to matter. Christine's story now stands as one of the most profound examples of cold case resolution through forensic genealogy, and a haunting reminder that justice, though slow, has a way of finding its path. The Jessop family finally knew the name of their daughter's killer, and for the first time in nearly 4 decades, Christine could rest. In the end, the locket was returned to her family, a symbol of innocence, of time lost, and of love that endured even when the world forgot. It hangs today in her mother's home near a photograph of Christine smiling with her baseball glove, forever 9 years old. Her story began with a child who never came home. It ended with a golden retriever who refused to move until the truth beneath his paws was found. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it waits quietly until someone finally listens. On a cool October morning in Queensville, Ontario, the world seemed still. The sun had barely risen, and a woman walking her golden retriever through a wooded path noticed the dog halt without warning. His nose pressed to the ground, his body tense. She tugged lightly on the leash, but he wouldn't budge. Instead, he pawed insistently at the dirt near a patch of tangled roots. When she bent down, brushing away a thin layer of soil, something silver glinted beneath her fingertips. A small, heart-shaped locket caked with rust and dirt. Inside were 2 faded letters, barely legible after decades of decay. C.J. That locket belonged to Christine Jessop, the 9-year-old girl whose disappearance and murder in 1984 shattered her small Canadian town, destroyed one man's life, and haunted investigators for more than 35 years. No one could have imagined that this quiet morning walk would lead to the final piece of a puzzle that had tormented an entire nation. Christine's story began on October 3rd, 1984. She was cheerful, bright, and full of life, known around town for her freckles, her love of animals, and her baseball glove that rarely left her side. That afternoon, she told her mother she was going to meet a friend after school. It was supposed to be a short walk, just a few blocks away, but she never made it. When she didn't come home for dinner, her mother called neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen her. By nightfall, the streets of Queensville were filled with volunteers carrying flashlights, shouting Christine's name into the empty fields. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Then, on New Year's Eve 1984, a farmer in Sunderland, about 50 kilometers away, stumbled upon her remains in a field. The discovery confirmed what everyone feared most. Christine had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The news tore through the town like wildfire. Fear turned to anger, and anger demanded someone to blame. That someone became Guy Paul Morin, the Jessop's quiet neighbor, a 24-year-old who loved classical music and kept to himself. He was shy, awkward, and an easy target for suspicion in a community desperate for answers. Police fixated on him, twisting coincidences into a narrative that fit. In 1985, Morin was arrested and charged with Christine's murder. Despite his unwavering claim of innocence, the evidence seemed to pile up. Fibers, a supposed confession overheard by a jail informant, and forensic testimony that would later crumble under scrutiny. In 1992, Morin was convicted. The Jessop family believed their nightmare had an ending, and the town tried to move on, but the truth was still buried. 3 years later, new DNA testing changed everything. The biological evidence from Christine's clothing didn't match Morin. It belonged to someone else entirely. He was exonerated in 1995, receiving a public apology and compensation for the years stolen from him. The wrongful conviction became one of the most infamous in Canadian history, exposing deep flaws in police work and forensic procedures. But while Morin finally walked free, the Jessop family was left with the same unbearable question: if not him, then who? For decades, that question echoed unanswered through the halls of law enforcement. The case went cold, locked away in filing cabinets, revisited only when new technology offered a sliver of hope. Then, in 2020, a new team from the York Regional Police Cold Case Unit decided to re-examine the evidence using genetic genealogy, a breakthrough method that compares crime scene DNA with profiles voluntarily uploaded to public ancestry databases. The process was tedious, involving hundreds of distant matches, family trees, and historical records. But after months of work, the path narrowed to one name: Calvin Hoover. He had been a neighbor of the Jessops at the time of Christine's murder, and he had even been interviewed briefly during the initial investigation. He'd passed under the radar, dismissed as unremarkable. What the police didn't know then was that Hoover had a violent past and had died by suicide in 2015, long before technology would reveal his secret. When detectives compared Hoover's stored DNA to the profile found on Christine's clothing, it was a perfect match. The odds of coincidence were astronomically low. After 36 years, the case was finally solved, but the final confirmation, the dog walker's discovery of Christine's locket, brought emotional closure that lab results never could. The locket had likely been torn from her during the assault and buried deep in the soil where Hoover had once walked his own dog. Forensic teams carefully excavated the site, confirming that the locket matched one Christine had worn in her last known photograph. It was a haunting connection, an object lost to time, unearthed by pure chance and instinct. When authorities announced the results in October 2020, the country held its breath. For the Jessop family, the revelation reopened old wounds, but finally gave them the truth they'd prayed for. Its closure, Christine's mother, Janet, said softly during a press conference, but it's not peace. The man who took her daughter's life was beyond punishment, and justice had arrived too late to face him. For Guy Paul Morin, the news was bittersweet. He released a brief statement: "I am relieved that the truth has finally come to light. I hope Christine's family can now find peace." His words carried decades of quiet resilience. A man once branded a murderer, now vindicated by the very science that the system had once failed to use properly. The story of Christine Jessop became more than just a solved case. It became a symbol of how forensic technology can rewrite history, clear the innocent, and expose the guilty, even long after death. It reminded the world that time doesn't erase truth, it only buries it until someone, or something, refuses to stop digging. Today, Christine's locket rests with her family, shining once again after being cleaned and restored. It's not just a piece of jewelry, it's a promise kept, a small proof that attention, persistence, and compassion can still bring justice from the darkest places. In the end, it wasn't a detective, a courtroom, or a confession that solved the case. It was a dog that refused to move and a woman who cared enough to look closer. A small act of awareness that unearthed the final piece of a tragedy decades in the making. Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with flashing lights or breaking news. Sometimes it comes quietly, on a foggy morning, carried by the heartbeat of a dog's stubborn paws. On a grey October morning in Ontario, the streets of Queensville were quiet, the air carrying the scent of rain and fallen leaves. A woman walking her golden retriever paused near the edge of a wooded path as her dog tugged hard on the leash, fixated on something beneath a cluster of overgrown weeds. Curious, she knelt down and brushed away the damp soil. What she uncovered wasn't trash or bone. It was a small, heart-shaped locket, tarnished with age. Inside, faintly engraved, were 2 letters, C, J. Those 2 letters reopened one of Canada's most haunting mysteries, the 1984 disappearance and murder of 9. Year, old Christine Jessop, a case that had devastated a family, destroyed an innocent man's life, and gone unsolved for more than 3 decades. The woman didn't know it, but her morning walk had just brought an entire town's nightmare back to life. Christine was an energetic little girl who loved animals, baseball, and helping her mom. On October 3rd, 1984, she left home to meet a friend just a few streets away. She promised she'd be back for dinner, but she never came home. Her disappearance sparked a desperate search. Neighbors combed through fields, officers searched creeks, and volunteers shouted her name into the darkness. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, until the search ended in tragedy. On December 31st, 1984, a farmer in Sunderland discovered Christine's body in a wooded area nearly 50 kilometers away. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The news shattered the small community and ignited one of the largest investigations in Ontario's history. Police quickly turned their suspicion toward Guy Paul Morin, the Jessop's next-door neighbor. He was quiet, eccentric, and played the clarinet, different enough to draw attention in a town desperate for closure. Investigators built their case on shaky evidence and unreliable witnesses. They painted Morin as an outsider and pushed for a conviction. In 1985, Morin was arrested. By 1992, after years of trials and appeals, he was convicted of Christine's murder and sentenced to life in prison. The Jessop family believed justice had been served. The town finally exhaled. But behind bars, Morin maintained his innocence. Then, 3 years later, science spoke where people had failed. In 1995, DNA testing, a technology unavailable during his trial, proved conclusively that Morin was not the killer. He was exonerated and released after spending years imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit. The Ontario government issued a public apology, and the investigation's mistakes became a national scandal. But for the Jessops, the relief was hollow. Their daughter's killer was still out there, hidden behind time and silence. Years passed, technology advanced, and in 2020, the York Regional Police Cold Case Unit reopened the file, determined to finish what decades of investigation could not. Detectives turned to genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge forensic tool that had recently identified killers in long, cold cases like the Golden State Killer in California. By comparing the DNA profile found on Christine's clothing to open genealogy databases, analysts built a complex family tree, tracing matches through distant cousins and ancestral lines. After months of painstaking work, one name rose to the top: Calvin Hoover. Hoover had lived in the same neighborhood as the Jessops in 1984. He was friendly, familiar, and even known to the family. Police had spoken to him briefly during the initial investigation, but nothing linked him directly to the crime at the time. What no one knew then was that Hoover had taken his own life in 2015. When investigators compared Hoover's preserved DNA to the genetic profile from the crime scene, the result was undeniable: a perfect match. The probability of error was less than 1 in a trillion. After 36 long years, Christine Jessop's killer was finally identified. The discovery of the locket by the dog walker that autumn morning added an emotional full stop to the case. Forensic teams confirmed it was the same one Christine had worn in her school photo, an heirloom that had vanished along with her. It had likely been dropped or buried near where Hoover once spent time, perhaps during one of his return visits to the area. Even after death, he had left traces of guilt behind, fragments of the truth waiting to be found. When police announced the findings in October 2020, the revelation stunned the nation. Christine's mother, Janet, wept as she spoke publicly for the first time in years. "We have waited so long for this," she said. "Now we finally know." The relief in her voice was mixed with sorrow. The man responsible could no longer face justice, but the truth had finally surfaced. For Guy Paul Moran, the moment was bittersweet. His name had long been cleared, but this confirmation sealed his innocence forever. In a statement, he said, "I am relieved for the Jessop family that the truth has been uncovered, though saddened that it came too late for real justice." His words carried decades of quiet strength, reminder of how easily lives can be destroyed by wrongful accusations. Christine's case now stands as one of the most powerful examples of how persistence and science can rewrite history. The tragedy of her death and the injustice that followed became a catalyst for reforms in Canadian law enforcement and forensic practice. It proved that truth, no matter how deeply buried, can still be found when people refuse to give up. Today, Christine's restored locket rests in her family's home, a small, shining symbol of love, loss, and endurance. It took a golden retriever's curiosity and a moment of attention to unearth it, but that small act brought the story full circle. For more than 3 decades, her case was a wound that never healed. Now, thanks to the power of science and the kindness of a stranger who stopped to look, Christine Jessop's story finally has its ending. Justice didn't come swiftly. It didn't come through courtrooms or confessions. It came quietly, through a dog's bark on a foggy morning, through a locket glinting beneath the soil, and through the persistence of those who believed that no case is ever truly cold until the truth is found. It was a cold Ontario morning when the fog rolled over the fields of Queensville, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot was the only thing breaking the silence. A woman walking her golden retriever followed the same path she always did, past the old fence line, through the thicket, and down toward the shallow creek. But this morning her dog stopped abruptly, pulling against the leash. He sniffed the ground, whined, and began pawing at a patch of dirt where the earth looked freshly disturbed. She crouched down, brushed away the top layer of soil, and froze. Beneath the mud was a glint of silver, a small, heart-shaped locket, its chain tangled and rusted. She picked it up carefully, wiping away the grime. Inside were 2 faintly engraved letters, C, J. She didn't know it, but that locket belonged to Christine Jessop, the 9-year-old girl who had vanished from this same area in 1984, a disappearance that became one of Canada's most infamous cold cases. What she held in her hand was more than jewelry. It was the piece of a story that had destroyed lives, ruined an innocent man's future, and haunted a family for 36 long years. Christine was a bright, freckled, animal, loving little girl who spent her days helping her mom and playing baseball with her brother, Ken. On October 3rd, 1984, she left home after school to meet a friend. She promised to be home for dinner. When night fell and she didn't return, panic spread through the small community of Queensville. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search. Police combed the surrounding fields, helicopters scanned the woods, and neighbors walked through creeks and ditches, calling her name into the dark. But there was no trace until December 31st, 1984, when a farmer in Sunderland, about 50 kilometers away, made a horrific discovery. Christine's body was found in a wooded area, partially concealed under brush. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered. The news shattered her family. For her parents, Janet and Bob Jessop, grief was immediate and unbearable. For the community, fear and outrage boiled into desperation. The police needed answers, and soon they turned their eyes toward a quiet, reserved man who lived next door, Guy Paul Morin. Morin was different. He was a loner, a musician who played the clarinet, and he didn't quite fit the mold of small-town normalcy. To investigators under pressure, that was enough. With limited evidence and growing public demand for justice, they built a narrative around him. In 1985, he was arrested and charged with Christine's murder. The trial was a media frenzy. Prosecutors pointed to fibers, matching evidence, and a jailhouse informant who claimed Morin had confessed. The public wanted closure, and in 1992, after years of appeals and retrials, Morin was convicted. But the truth was far more complicated and far more devastating. 3 years later, DNA technology advanced enough to test the biological evidence from Christine's clothing. The results were clear and indisputable. The DNA did not match Guy Paul Morin. After spending years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, Morin was exonerated in 1995. The Ontario government issued a formal apology, acknowledging one of the worst wrongful convictions in the nation's history. The Jessop family was heartbroken all over again. The man they thought had taken their daughter's life was innocent, which meant the real killer was still out there. The case went cold once more, the file gathering dust for decades while the family tried to heal. But time has a way of uncovering truth. In 2020, the York Regional Police Cold Case Unit decided to reopen Christine's file using genetic genealogy, revolutionary technique that had recently helped identify lost killers across the world. Detectives uploaded the old DNA sample from Christine's case into a genealogical database, cross-referencing it with thousands of profiles from Ancestry and Family Tree Services. The process took months. But slowly a picture emerged. Analysts traced distant relatives, building an extensive family tree that spanned generations. And from those branches, one name stood out, Calvin Hoover. Hoover had been a family acquaintance back in 1984, someone who knew the Jessops personally. He was friendly, approachable, even helpful. He'd been briefly interviewed at the start of the investigation, but was never considered a suspect. No one suspected that he was the one who had taken Christine's life. By the time police identified him in 2020, Hoover was already dead, having taken his own life in 2015. But his DNA, preserved in police databases, matched the sample from Christine's clothing with absolute certainty. The probability of error was virtually zero. The dog walker's discovery of the locket months later gave investigators one final piece of emotional evidence, proof that Christine's memory still lingered in the soil where her story began and ended. Forensic teams confirmed that the locket matched one missing from her belongings, likely torn off during the attack. It had sat buried for decades, a silent witness to the horror of that night. When the York Regional Police announced their findings in October 2020, the country stopped to listen. After 36 years, the truth had finally surfaced. Christine's mother, Janet Jessop, stood before reporters, her voice trembling but steady. "We've waited so long for answers," she said. "Now at least we can breathe." For Guy Paul Morin, the revelation was a painful relief. His name was cleared long ago, but now the world knew beyond any doubt that he was innocent. He released a simple statement: "I am grateful that the truth has finally come out. My heart goes out to the Jessop family. I hope they can find peace." Christine Jessop's story became more than a case. it became a testament to the power of perseverance, science, and faith in truth. Her murder led to fundamental changes in Canadian justice, from evidence handling to wrongful conviction laws. But it also left a lasting mark on everyone touched by it, a reminder of how fragile innocence can be and how long justice sometimes takes to find its way home. Today, that small heart-shaped locket rests with Christine's family. It has been cleaned and preserved, its silver surface polished to a soft shine. It's no longer buried in the earth. It's displayed beside a photo of Christine in her blue jacket, smiling, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that time can never erase. A dog walker's morning routine unearthed the final piece of a puzzle that haunted Canada for decades. The truth had been buried, but not forgotten. Because sometimes, even after years of silence, justice finds its voice in the most unexpected ways, in a heartbeat, a bark, and a flash of silver beneath the leaves. In the end, Christine Jessop's story became more than a crime. It became a symbol of truth's quiet persistence. For 36 years, her name echoed through courtrooms, headlines, and broken hearts. An innocent man lost years of his life. A family lost their child, and a community lost its peace. But through it all, time never truly buried what mattered most. It wasn't a detective's hunch or a confession that solved this case. It was the steady march of science, the tireless dedication of cold case investigators, and one small act of awareness from a woman and her dog on an ordinary morning. That moment reminded the world that sometimes justice doesn't shout. It whispers, waits, and surfaces when the world least expects it. The small silver locket that once hung around Christine's neck has been returned to her family. It shines once again, not as a relic of tragedy, but as a symbol of endurance, innocence, and love that outlasts the years. To the Jessop family, may Christine's memory continue to light the dark corners where truth hides. And to all who still wait for answers in the silence of unsolved cases, never lose hope, because even after decades of darkness, a single discovery, a single clue, or even a single moment of compassion can change everything. Christine Jessop's story will never be forgotten. It reminds us that justice may be delayed, but it is never truly gone. It only waits for someone, somewhere, to uncover it.